Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel, and this is Exploring the Quran and the Bible. The following episode is a discussion with Professor Sean Anthony of The Ohio State University about his work on some gory topics, such as the crucifixion, but also really important work on early Islam, including the Quran, as seen in his most recent book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith. It's a wide-ranging discussion. I really encourage you to listen to the end because it gets really interesting in the last 15 minutes or so, where we begin to speak about specific incidents or reports attributed to the Prophet's biography and how those can be seen, whether they are historical reports or part of storytelling, and how generally you can evaluate the historicity of reports. So really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for coming over to this channel. I'd really be grateful if you take a moment just to subscribe and also to like this particular video. That gives me reason to keep producing this content because I don't make a single cent doing it. But it's fun, and part of the fun is having conversations like this one with Professor Sean Anthony. Okay, we're beginning. It's the beginning. Professor Sean Anthony, how are you doing?
Hi, doing good.
Good. Yeah, great to have you here on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. We know each other for a long time.
Yeah. I bet I know you longer than know of you, at least longer than you've known me. I remember I saw you give a paper on mines at like a Wookmas conference when I was like a really young graduate student.
Okay.
And I was very impressed.
I remember that in Germany. Yeah, Manfred Kropp was there, and I think was that Jane McAuliffe might have been there.
Oh, I don't even remember. I was really young. That was before anyway. No.
Oh, it's great to be with you here, and you know, you're at the Ohio State University, but also have passed by South Bend now and then, so we get to see each other sometimes in person. But this is an opportunity for me to ask you serious questions about your scholarship and also some things that are not so academic. So let me go ahead and read a basic bio, and then you can fill in the gaps if I miss anything. So everyone, Professor Sean Anthony is Associate Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at Ohio State University. I missed the this time. I said it the first time. The Ohio State University, and author of The Caliph and the Heretic, Ibn Saba and the Origins of Shiism, and Crucifixion and Death as Spectacle, Umayyad Crucifixion in its late antique context. He's also the editor and translator of The Expeditions, an early biography of Muhammad by Ma'mar ibn Rashid. Very important work, which we're not going to get into too much today, so maybe that will be for episode number 2 with Professor Anthony. And most recently of Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, the Making of the Prophet of Islam. I can show off a couple of these. So here's a crucifixion book. I don't know if it had it. Does it have a jacket? And
no, it's a nice scholarly AOS volume.
Yeah. And then here's Muhammad and the Empires of Faith.
Yeah, nice.
And I've got Ma'mar ibn Rashid there behind me somewhere. So yeah, and I mean, all sorts of articles, and he's really active with public scholarship on Twitter as well. Is there anything you'd add to the bio there, just like academic side?
No, unless that covers, I think, the basics. Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay, great. Well, I usually like to start just like getting to know you better, or getting to know the guest better. And so, yeah, maybe you can fill us in on your journey into Islamic studies. Did you know from an early age that you were interested in the study of Islam, the study of Islam, the history of Islam, and how did it all take place?
Yeah. I mean, this is a story that can be told so many different ways, depending on when you begin or whatever. I guess one of my earliest memory, I'll tell you my earliest memory of even hearing about Islam or anything like that, and conceptually that really sticks in my head. I was like 15 years old, world history class, 10th grade. And it was part of the component of the history class where you go through the world religions. I can't remember all of them they were, but they hit what is used the traditional basics, you know, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, man, it really sucked to choose the wrong religion and have to go to hell, because like straight up. And I remember thinking as a young person in my head, I was like, man, you know, what religions would really be interesting to me. And so for Judaism, I was like, well, I'm not born Jewish, so it's not really my business. So, you know, I'll leave that one to the side. And then with Hinduism and Buddhism, I was like, well, if I get it wrong, I'll get reincarnated and I get another chance. I looked at Christianity as like Christianity, Islam, oh, that's a really high stakes religions. And so maybe you should take those kind of seriously. That same kind of teacher, he used to always have like the nerdy kids come in during lunch to play euchre and things like that.
Okay, does this mean it was somewhere in the Midwest if you're playing euchre?
Yeah, this is somewhere in the Midwest.
Yeah, it's a card game, everyone. If you're not from the Midwest of the US, yeah.
We have like euchre tournaments and all sorts of things like that, which is odd, but it's a fun game. I recommend it. It's like hearts or spades if you ever played anything like that. And so he used to play euchre a lot, and one time I knew his room was available, and I noticed in class that he had this thing Qur'an in the background. I never looked at it, never saw it. I asked him to pick it if I could just look at it, and I remember started flipping through it. It was a Yusuf Ali translation, so it has a nice little commentary
with the footnotes.
Looked up all the Jesus passages, and I was just really intrigued. And it kind of always just stuck in my mind after that. Later on, so I was kind of a little bit of a wayward youth.
So where was this, Sean? So
this was in Ohio. That's where I grew up in Ohio, and it's small. It's like it's literally it was like a county school, so outside any city or whatever. I lived at a little wide place in the road called Fremont City. Not too far from Columbus, actually, where I am today. But yeah, it's just out in the sticks, basically.
Okay.
And so and then after that, I didn't really think about anything, but I was a little bit of wayward youth. I had, when I was around 16 or so, a very religious experience. And for me, I thought that meant that I wanted to go into ministry. And so I went and I went to college. It's the first person who went to college in my family. And I was doing theology. I didn't want to do a theology degree at a Bible college. That didn't last very long for me. I kind of had a crisis of faith in the middle of it. I guess I'm still in a crisis of faith insofar as I don't consider myself a person of faith or a believer. Okay. But what it led me to do is that I felt like I had to get out of there. What I really should have done if I was a young person, theoretically, I should have just left the Bible school and enrolled in a place like in Ohio State and things like that. The tuition would have been cheaper. The student loans would have been cheaper. But I didn't really know what to do. I was like, well, I'm in the middle of this degree, and I got to finish it in order to get my college education. So might as well keep on going somehow. And so what I decided to do is to get credit by doing a study abroad. Right. And I was deciding between Russia, because I liked all the novelists, like the Tolstoys, the Dostoevskys, and all these guys, and the Middle East, because, hey, who went to see where Jesus walked and where all the Bible stories happen and stuff like that. So I chose a program not in Israel, Palestine, but rather in Cairo, Egypt.
Okay.
At the end of that program, I went from Cairo to Istanbul and then back to the United States. And it took me through Jordan, took me through Syria. It was the first time I'd ever left the country in my life. How old was I? I think I was 19.
Okay.
And it just exploded in my brain. And so I kind of wanted to go back. And when I did graduate, I decided to do a master's degree at the American University in Cairo, learn some Arabic, do Middle Eastern studies. And I was kind of hooked on the region after that. That's kind of
So can you tell us a little bit more about, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, just like that first trip you had? I'm just thinking back to my own past.
Yeah.
So which somehow analogous. So my first trip to the Middle East was to Jordan. And also in college, and I was just I felt a very strong culture shock, even though in my case, half of my family is Arab American. So I heard some Arabic and stuff growing up, but still coming from the suburbs of the US to hearing the call to prayer, the Friday sermon, people being very religious. Was that I don't know, especially because you mentioned that you had your own faith journey at the time, or in and out of faith.
I don't know. It's hard to recreate that initial impression. Well, the initial impression that I do remember is that I was sick as a dog for the first week and a half after arriving in Cairo. We literally landed. I went to the pyramids, came back, and then laid in bed for a week and a half.
Okay.
No, but honestly, what it was is it was just very different from any, it was really different from any experience I had to that moment. I just gotta say, as a young person in general, I think this is true with people that like books and have certain kind of curiosity and ask uncomfortable questions. You tend to be alienated from your peers, right? You tend to have a certain openness towards other cultures and other experiences because you feel yourself,
Sounds right to me. Yeah.
Ill at ease with the people in your surroundings. You're like, and so for me, it was like the newness and then really the thing that left, I think, a very big impression on me. It's just the receptivity and the kind of the welcomeness that I had from, basically Egyptians, Jordanians, especially Syrians, wherever I went. And I was just very impressed by the hospitality and kindness that I experienced. It's kind of a foreigner kind of traveling around. And it's just the region, and if you're interested in politics, if you're interested in modern geopolitics, if you're interested in medieval history, if you're interested in ancient history, it has it all. There's something there for anyone. It also has its challenges as well, obviously. But yeah, I was just totally taken in. It wasn't at that moment that I decided I'm going to do Quranic studies. Like most people, I was mostly concerned with political issues, and then it was the Palestinian-Israeli crisis and peace negotiations and things like this, which still seemed like they're actually going to go somewhere at the time that I went, which was in the late 90s. So it was an interesting time. So
Are you an Egypt fan still? I know you mentioned also Syria and Jordan, but do you like the Egyptian dialect? Do you have?
I haven't been to Egypt in a long time.
Because then you went back and spent 2 years at AUC. Is that right?
Yeah. And it ended up being like 3 years that I spent there because I staggered it. But yeah, I haven't been to Egypt in so long that I bet if I went back today, and I keep on intending to go back, I wouldn't really recognize it. My plan, at least what I always thought that I was going to do after I got my Ph.D. and stuff like that, is so my wife, I have two stepdaughters, so my wife and they're half Syrian. And so my assumption was always that, hey, I'm going to establish a study abroad in Syria or something like that. That's kind of what my long-term plan was. But with the obvious kind of events that happened in the world, that became like less and less plausible. Egypt, I want to go back. I actually am trying to make plans to go back and to kind of revive my connections and things like that, but I really have not had kind of the opportunity to. So once you get your family, like when I was traveling around kind of freewheeling as like a bachelor, I could do things like sleep on the rooftop of a hostel and that's which I did all the time, but like when you're traveling around with your kids and stuff, it's that doesn't really happen. So but I hope that now that my kids are older and things are a bit more stable for me, I can rekindle those connections.
I still struggle with the Egyptian dialect. My wife is Lebanese, and so Lebanese dialect is fine. Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian is okay. But the problem is that she loves to watch Egyptian movies, especially comedies with Adel Imam. And I usually can't get the jokes, and it's very awkward because she's laughing at the right time. And I'm like, wait, why are you laughing right now? Okay, let's get into some academic stuff. Maybe we'll circle back to the rest of life. But I thought we start, our conversation is going to be about your works, especially the book on the crucifixion and most recent book on Muhammad, which is about Muhammad, but is also about the field. At least it's the way I read it. So we can talk about that more in a bit. But maybe we'll just start with the field of early Islam Quranic studies. So what would you say are the main questions what are the big questions out there that are being debated, and anything else, observations about the health or the problems in the field?
So when health, I'll start with health and problems, as that's the most easy thing. Health and problems is maintaining American and European institutional interest in giving folks that do this type of work jobs, tenure track jobs. And this is a problem across the humanities.
Right.
But I think we enjoyed a time period where religious studies departments were growing for a while, interest in the Middle East and Arabic were growing for a while, and I think we're at a post-boom era. We have been for several years. And I do get concerned about what's going to be the institutional future of our field. And we're a field that's struggled because of wars, oftentimes, both in not mostly in the Middle East actually, but in Europe, to kind of have generational continuity, right? And to really build paradigms. I don't really know if we have a paradigm, to be perfectly honest. A lot of times when you read things from generation to generation, it seems like a lot of, we're always constantly reinventing the wheel. The closest thing that we have to a paradigm is probably Noldicki, and kind of his inheritors like Neuwirth and Sinai and those folks. But it's really hard to do that kind of intergenerational building. And Gabriel, you've done immense amount of work in making that type of intergenerational building possible. And I want to thank you for that, take this opportunity to do that. I think that one of the most important people to do this. So that's my number one concern. But I don't really know what to do about that. Right. So when it comes to actually brass tacks and doing the work in the meantime,
no, I think can I just jump in for a second and I mean, you and I probably both saw a wave of things on Twitter in the past couple of months of people sort of announcing their departure from academics, either after completing the PhD and bouncing around for a while, or in the midst, sort of seeing what's the prospects for a job looking very bleak and just saying, no, I'm going another route. So, and that's just a stark contrast then the field. I mean, at least when I finished my PhD in 2003, and there were, the job market was good, and a lot of people had places to choose from. And now the job market outside of academics may be pretty good, but not inside of academics. So. Yeah,
I mean, the only other statement I'll say about that is, I think our generation, we used to make fun. I don't know if you ever made this joke, but we used to make fun of the generation before us, the way that sometimes they would get jobs through a phone call and through a friend, right? And the next thing you know, you have an appointment at Yale, Columbia, Chicago, whatever. It's like, oh, good for them, right? And I think the joke about us is going to be, when they were on the job market, they had like 3 campus invites the first year they went on the market, right? And that is that era is totally gone. Yeah. And so I think now, as a person that has tenure and is trying to advise and help people enter the field, which our field needs, and I think the world needs, it just I want to make sure that we have a way of advising them well, considering they have different challenges as they're going to go. Right. At the same
time, how about on sort of the the intellectual side of this question? I mean, what are the main issues, debates within not only Quranic studies, but because you're also an historian? At least I think of you as both a philologist and a historian. So in Quranic studies, but also early Islamic history, what are the main sort of questions, stakes, debates on that side?
I think that as a nice segue, I think one of the main things that has changed and that has shaped our debates is the kind of skills that you're expected to bring to bear on the Quranic corpus and on the Quran itself. I think we have this this older tradition that was said, you have to have very, very good Arabic, right? And you have to know how to read the Quran and have a good grasp of Arabic grammar. And you have to have a good grasp of the kind of the lexicographical and exegetical resources of the Islamic tradition and know how to navigate those, right? And so, in other words, you have like this silo of the tradition that you have to understand and master very well and to be able to kind of exploit, right? as a philologist or whatever. And I think that usually, I think the way that most programs train people then was that, okay, now you can also take your other language, whether it's Persian or Turkish or whatever, but you're fitting yourself inside of this kind of Middle East, this area studies, civilizational model, right? That tends to have very strict boundaries. So you're studying that Eastern kind of civilization. I think Quranic studies has thankfully moved away from that. So now instead of just bringing Arabic to bear, now you're expected to do something that's a bit more chronologically close. So you would be very, very much helped if you acquire Syriac, if you acquire any other dialect of Aramaic, anything really Greek or Hebrew and things like this. And I think one of the things that this has done to transform Quranic studies is to make it more open-facing towards people that work with biblical literature and patristics and things like that. But also, hopefully, I think it's making us feel that is more inviting to people that are kind of working next to us. A lot of times, literally chronologically and geographically next to us, and like where they're located, but aren't kind of engaging with our scholarship. We're not engaging with their scholarship, and I think that's one of the main challenges that we need to do. That we get, more Quranic studies people attending rabbinic studies conferences, more Quranic studies people attending patristics conferences, and vice versa. I think that kind of exchange is potentially very exciting.
Right, crucial.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask about biblical studies precisely because I'm in a theology department here at Notre Dame. So I'm sort of the Islamicist on this hallway. I do have two colleagues in this hallway that also do non-Christian religions. One does Buddhism, one does Hinduism. Everyone else does Christian theology, I think without exception, in our hallway here in Malloy Hall. So I'm like living around all these Christian theologians and including the people in the Bible section, which at Notre Dame we call Christianity and Judaism and Antiquity, but it's basically Bible. So I wonder what your thoughts are about how Quranic studies compares to biblical studies, and maybe to push that a little further. There was an article, I forget the name of the author, but he wrote about a concern with protectionism in New Testament studies.
Yeah.
I could guess, but it's better if I look it up and don't embarrass myself. He said this is a danger, and sort of, I think, warning against the influence of more conservative voices within New Testament studies who want to reclaim or restore traditional ways of looking at the formation of the New Testament canon. So anyway, you could comment on that. Is there protectionism in Quranic studies, or just compare the fields generally?
Yeah. So I would say if I look at biblical study, like this issue, and biblical studies and Quranic studies, the main imbalance, at least if we look at the Western Academy, is there is the type of institutions that are available and that are being served by the field. So you work at a different institution than I do. I'm at a public institution. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm a public employee. Like I'm on the role of the taxpayer. And so, and I conceive of my role as being kind of different than that, of someone that could maybe working at a private institution with a religious mission or a seminary or something like that. And I think that, I don't want to speak for biblical studies, but if something like protectionism and things like that's always going to be there. To me, you have to have a paradigm where everybody gets a seat at the table, and you have kind of a respectful way of proceeding with kind of the discourse of the field, if it's going to be coherent. And for Quranic studies in particular, one of the things that we are in need of, and I think we're undertaking this now, is moving away from kind of the older model that's dominated predominantly by white males from a European background, to one that actually reflects the demographics of the country that we're living in, and particularly the presence and prominence of Muslims in the academy and also in our own country, and also one that is true to the international profile that our institutions supposedly claim to.
Right.
Like, we're not merely parochial institutions of the United States, but also international institutions. And one of the tensions, I think, with inside the national vision of that is that there's not a lot of Islamic seminaries that exist,
Right.
not nearly at the scale of kind of Jewish seminaries or Christian seminaries and things
Right.
like that. They are emerging and they are becoming prominent. And honestly, like, they like Christian seminaries have very different missions than Ohio State, which is a public university. They produce very compelling scholarship, and I think we'll be noticing this being increasingly the case in a UK context, American context as well. I think in many cases it's already the case, where the scholarship that is being produced on the Quran, I think, will rely upon Muslim communities flourishing in these countries where our institutions are located. Because for the most part, the students that I teach are from a Muslim background, at my public university, and people that are interested in kind of the books that I read and the books that I write myself. They are of, either they grew up as Muslims or culturally, they feel like a personal connection to that. If we're kind of not serving those communities and asking questions that are important to them and things like that, I think it'll be to the detriment of our field.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I hear people say that, there are lots of places in the West where you can do constructive, if that's the right term, Christian theology.
Yeah.
And even exegesis of the Bible in a theological way.
Yeah.
And that's true. I think that's kind of true and not true. I'm not an expert in the field of Christian theology in North America, but just observing my colleagues here, I actually think that even within a theology department, that is like a disputed point, because then there's a lot of pressure from institutions like the Society of Biblical Literature to do historical critical scholarship.
Yeah.
And so I think my colleagues who may be more theologically minded, who want to engage from a faith-based perspective, the New Testament or the whole Bible, they feel pressured not to do that in order to have legitimacy among their peers at places like SBL. So, but then there are also sections of our department that are like systematic theology, moral theology, and there it's theology, it's not religious studies. So
you guys do biblical theology, which is like separate from historical criticism?
Yeah, not very much. No, I think most of our Bible scholars, one exception might be Gary Anderson, who's appeared on this channel. So people check out the interview with Gary Anderson, who's an Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar, who's written a book on sin and a book on charity, which are definitely theological readings of the Bible.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, for the most part, my colleagues, I'm going to do serious work. Anyway, when I say serious, theology can also be serious, but they want to do serious historical critical work.
Yeah.
I should have completed the sentence before moving on to my next one. Yeah, but I get the point that for Muslims who don't want to separate their theological interests from the work that they do professionally, it can be tough. Like, it can be tough in the Euro-American Academy. Germany is an exception, of course, because they've at least founded a number of Islamic theological faculties at state German universities, places like Tübingen and others. But anyway, well, okay. I think we should move on because time is wasting away, and there's a lot I want to ask you about your books, which I think are models of serious historical critical engagement with early Islamic texts, not only the Quran, but others. You also model how to integrate both the study of late antiquity with a study of early Islam. You sort of alluded to this, but earlier in Islamic studies, at least for a certain period in the academy that wasn't done, you sort of either did late antiquity, so you were in Jewish and Christian studies, or you did early Islam. So, but I thought we'd start with speaking about the Crucifixion book. And I have to ask you how you got interested in this topic. Right? It's not like a very rosy topic to deal with. So how did you get interested in writing a book on crucifixion?
So first off, it started off as an article that became too long. So that's why it's in the shape that it is. But it began, so I was I was taking a class with my dear advisor, Professor Wadad Al-Qadi, and she has this great class that she used to teach, where we go.
University of Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's called the biographical dictionaries, which there's this great historiographical tradition in the Arabic literary tradition where you write history of the community, world, etc., locations, but you organize it not chronologically, but according to biography. And so the way that she would organize the class is we do like the major central works, and then when we're done with the major central works, we go into more minor works. And I got randomly assigned this book called Kitab al-Mahan by Abdul Arab al-Tamimi. And basically the title of the book means the Book of Trials. And it was a collection of the biographies of prominent scholars and holy persons from the early history of Islam up to the day of Abu Arab al-Tamimi, this North African scholar. And he mentions all the horrible things that happened, to these people. And so like when so-and-so was flogged, when so-and-so was imprisoned, when so-and-so was exiled. And he has one section that was when so-and-so was crucified. And I was like, wow, that's crucified, dang, and it made me wonder, like, well, was crucifixion still a thing? And what was crucifixion like? And I was under the general impression that crucifixion after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, which is like totally gone. I knew some examples of like the Jesuits when they're proselytizing in Japan, stuff like this. But for the most part, crucifixion was like is door now, right? And so was this actually crucifixion's improper way of reading the Arabic word? And so I got interested in all these kind of questions.
And that's the only one, it's just salaba is the word.
It is salaba. Yeah, it's I mean, there's other ways of saying it, but okay. Just salaba is the word, or salb. And once I started looking more into it, I realized that one of the problems was I was bringing to the word a certain assumption that I inherited from the iconography of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross. And that's exactly what crucifixion looked like. And that was exactly what crucifixion was at all times and places and blah, blah, blah. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that crucifixion is really just a word for taking someone's body and attaching it to a piece of wood. It doesn't matter what shape it is, either as a sort of punishment, whether while alive or post-mortem. It can be what I call like an instrument or a machine of death in a way, or it could just be a way of displaying a dead body.
Right.
And so I started exploring that broader understanding of crucifixion in kind of late antique context. And the first question that I had in my mind was, when the Quran says that, you should crucify highway robbers and people that spread corruption in the earth and things like this, the question is, or is it reviving a practice that was abolished or something like that? And what I found out is that crucifixion actually survived past the Christianization of the Roman Empire, but also it was not just a Roman phenomenon. You also find it under the Sassanids in Persia and things like that. And that even what crucifixion entailed, and it could be as a type of punishment, evolved under early Islamic period. So I tried to kind of trace that and say, like, well, what was crucifixion in Roman late antiquity? What was crucifixion in Persian Sassanid late antiquity? And what was crucifixion like under the Umayyads as well? Right. So I could have kept on going, but that's all kind of
yeah, I don't know how interesting it would be or how easy it is to communicate through a conversation, but so the Arabic word salb or salaba and the verb is related, I guess, to the Aramaic, the Jewish Aramaic word, but not to the Christian Syriac term, which is something like zakaf.
Yeah, zakaf, yeah.
So, but it does appear in the Quran as well. Yeah, I mean, one thought I had is, you mentioned that crucifixion is not only an instrument of death, but can also be refer simply to the showing of a dead body as a type of humiliation or scandal. I mean, could you speak to that a bit more? I mean, what would be the point of not just killing someone, but then, hanging their body up for all to see.
Yeah. So oftentimes, and this became standard, is crucifixion was used as a I never know how to say with which G to use, a gibbet or gibbet, one of them, but it's used as like a sort of way to display someone's executed body.
Mhm.
And so say you have a rebel, and that rebel is executed or dies in battle. Instead of giving that body kind of a proper burial, you expose it to ignominy and shame, right? And it has a number of functions. So one of the functions is seeing that horrible fate of the shamed, usually denuded body rotting for an indeterminate time. It's supposed to serve as a deterrent for anybody that would do such a thing. It's sort of like what they used to say, like we used to take like pirates and they would put them in a gibbet, like when the tide was out, and then when it would come in, they would drown and then just leave the bodies out on the shore to deter pirates and things like that. This I have deterrence. One of the things that I kind of felt was happening in the early Islamic period as well is crucifixion is pretty much in stark contrast, especially of dead bodies, is pretty much in stark contrast to the sort of reverence and the sort of pious interring of the body in the ground that is normative in Islamic law. You basically give the body its final washing, you do the prayers over, and then you turn the ground. It's kind of a final farewell to the deceased person. And the janazah and the prayer and the washing the body is a way of kind of sealing their kind of membership, their earthly membership in the body of the Muslim community.
Believers, right?
Yeah. And so by denying their crucifixion basically inverts that. So instead of affirming their inclusion in the community, you basically crucify them and display their body as an example from their exclusion, not just from society, and as proof of their the fact that they did something wrong, but also it's a mark of their kind of exclusion. And there's a lot of really interesting examples of crucifixion that happened to descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Probably one of the most famous examples that is described in the most detail is the crucifixion of Zayd ibn Ali, who is the great grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, I believe. He's Zayd ibn Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali. So anyway, so one of the things really fascinating about it, we actually have a letter of the Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik that kind of gives a little bit of the ideological rationale behind his crucifixion. And Hisham calls it his crucifixion, he's characterized as al-hujja fil uquba. That is, the fact that God had given Hisham the caliphate and empowered him to impose such punishments was kind of this definitive proof of the falsity of Zayd's claim to be a legitimate claimant to the caliphate that Hisham occupied. And his ability to punish and to display his punished body was proof of God's kind of favoring him. Otherwise, Zayd would have been successful, in other words.
Okay, I want to speak specifically about Zayd, and then you give another example of Abdullah ibn Zubair, and speak about both of those. I wanted to turn to the Quran first, so if that's okay.
That's right.
Yeah, because just to sort out a little bit, because the verb does appear in the Quran. I want to ask first about the verse which refers to the crucifixion or non-crucifixion of Jesus. So in Surah An-Nisa, Quran 4:157, in there, the order is interesting because you mentioned that sometimes crucifixion could follow death, because it does say وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. So they did not kill him and they did not crucify him. I don't know, is that connected to what you're saying about crucifixion as following death and not as the instrument of death?
Yeah, it's I never thought about that as the post-mortem order. I have a lot of thoughts on that verse that I haven't given yet.
Okay, but don't hesitate to give those.
No, it's okay. So
give us
that verse in particular. No, I don't like. I don't think it's talking about a post-mortem crucifixion of Jesus. My own kind of theory is that it's referring to the episode of Jesus' crucifixion as found in the life of Jesus, the Jewish life of Jesus.
Okay.
In which there's a dispute between the followers of Jesus and the faithful Jews about what happens to Jesus's body. So in the Toledat Yeshua is what it's called, this Jewish life of Jesus. They crucify Jesus, but then his body disappears.
Okay.
And the explanation is that it's taken by a river or something like that.
Okay.
A stream. And the Christians or the followers of Jesus, they say, oh no, God raised him to heaven. You didn't actually successfully crucify him.
Oh,
That is so similar to what's going on there.
Verse.
Yeah, and I think, and one thing I think that you have shown too, in particular, is that verse follows this kind of litany of kind of bad things that the Israelites did, and so because it's like a historical list of bad things, and then the Quran kind of basically takes the side of Jesus in this dispute. So I think there might be something like that going on there more than the crucifixion.
Yep,
thing.
that word might not be a big deal. Okay,
Yeah.
and then the other verse I wanted to speak about is Quran chapter 5 or Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 33, which you address in the book. But yeah, I mean, here it speaks about the punishment of those who literally conduct war against God and the messenger, which is interesting that they're sort of brought together there, both God and the messenger, in that the punishment is, among other things, that they be killed or crucified. So again, maybe once again, I'm reading too much into it, but it says that yuqattalu aw yusallabu. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that verse generally, or about why is it or being killed or crucified?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole litany of things. It's not being killed or crucified, or having your arms and leg, your hands and leg cut from
opposite sides. Yep.
Or being exiled. And I think that or connection is really interesting. And the reception of that verse in the early legal literature, the way that this is dealt with is often it's advised to a lot of the kind of early legal claims that basically it says that the imam is sort of is given a kind of host of options that he can choose from. Okay. So he could combine them or not apply them at will. All right. However, other scholars actually say that it depends upon the crime. So if you are just merely guilty of brigandage in thieving, then you get only one of the series of the punishments. But if you combine thievage and brigandage with murdering people, then you get compounding punishments. Okay. And so they have different ways of deciding how these things all apply. But that one of the things that I do think is really quite interesting is how by the way, I am saying brigandage for this Yaharbun. It's ala wa rasulihi. I think that's what the phrase. Yep. And usually in brigandage is my translation of what is known in the legal literature as hiraba, or this sort of spreading corruption on the earth and defying God and his prophet. I see that as more like God and his prophet kind of represent the authority. Right? Okay. So they're spreading corruption and they're warring or defying his authority. Right. So, and it's like the same way, like when you commit a crime, you don't just commit a crime against the individual, but you also commit a crime against the state or against the king, or in this case, against God and his prophet. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So very, very strong language. To me, that verse represents the way in which the status of the messenger is elevated in material usually attributed to the Medinan period. Yeah. Where an offense against God or an offense against the messenger, where there are references to obedience of the messenger. Yeah, so I mean, that's a question that's been studied by a number of people, including Andrew O'Connor, who's at St. Norbert's University, wrote a dissertation on this point. I forget if he uses the term Rasulology, just to indicate like the higher status that the messenger seems to get in some ways. Yeah, but maybe that's another question. So yeah, back to last point before we get to the other book, but just these two case studies Abdullah ibn Zubair, son of one of the Prophet's companions, leads this big revolt in Mecca, principally. You can correct me if I get any of the history wrong. Interestingly, because I think it's his brother Urwa who comes up in the other book, right? As a source for the for certain accounts or reports about Muhammad. But that was a serious revolt, right? Like Abdullah ibn Zubair wasn't a small thing. He minted coins, establishing his own claims to the imamate, or to leadership within the community, not the Shiite imamate. And so maybe the drama of his crucifixion matches the level of threat that he actually posed. Not sure. Yeah, maybe I'll start with that. Like, what does that proposition sound like to you?
Yeah, so there's Ibn Zubayr's death is a big can of worms. So let's see where. So I guess the basic story is pretty scandalous in and of itself. I mean, I wouldn't say he was a rebel. I would say that he is one of many rival emirs at the time, as an Amir al-Mu'minin or candidates for the commandership of the faithful or whatever. I don't think he ever used caliph. Whether or not we can use caliph for these early guys, I think the verdict is maybe a little bit still out, but they are anachronistically called caliphs by the tradition. But so the interesting thing about Ibn Zubayr, and we have this written by contemporaries as well, is that the seat of his rebellion was essentially Mecca, and he chose Mecca for an interesting reason. He chose Mecca because you're ostensibly not allowed to conduct any violence within its sacred precincts, within its haram. And in order for Abd al-Malik and his general al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf, is the guy that comes down and actually kills him, to really put it into his movement, they have to besiege Mecca itself. Or the second time that really ever happened. And they burned down the Kaaba. I mean, it's a mess. And Ibn Zubayr is killed on the battlefield. And I mean, this gets a bit grisly, so I'll apologize. But he is cut up into pieces and he is kind of crucified alongside a dog, even. And there's all sorts of really interesting anecdotes about this crucifixion. And what it meant and things like that. One of the key ideas was, well, who is ultimately responsible for it? Later historiography blamed al-Hajjaj, who has a very notorious reputation as absolutely kind of merciless governor, and not well known for his piety by any means. And he's, once word reaches Abd al-Malik about how Ibn Zubayr's body has been desecrated, he tells al-Hajjaj to give him a proper burial, right? Is that true? Okay. Yeah. Okay. And the other things that are really interesting about it is some anecdotes suggest that Ibn Zubayr himself was expecting to be crucified. And this is the anecdotes surrounding what he did in preparation for it, I thought was very interesting. And it helped me kind of understand a little bit what the meaning of crucifixion was, and some of its more visceral forms and as a spectacle. So what he begins to do is he takes musk and he begins to consume massive amounts of musk, this Ibn Zubayr, in anticipation of being killed. And the idea is that he was basically consuming this musk in order to not stink when his body was crucified. Wow. And musk is a very important aromatic as well, because it's in a lot of the traditions, the kind of the soil of paradise is said to smell of musk or to be made out of musk and things like this. So by consuming this musk, he wanted to have like the smells of paradise associated with body, rather than the putrescence of the rotting of his flesh. And it's interesting, and he's not the only person who this happened to, that when Hajjaj kind of crucifies what's left of his body, he puts a rotting dead animal next to him. And we have this, not just dogs, but fish and other things too. And the reason why, it seems, as far as I can tell, is he wants to kind of increase the putrescence of the smell from crucifixion, right? And send the message home. There's also really interesting things too that are kind of counter narratives against what his crucifixion is supposed to say. So you have this very touching scene where his mother, a daughter of Abu Bakr, the first caliph, her name's Asma, is at the foot of his cross or whatever contraption he's crucified on. And she's like, of course, sad and really beyond consolation. But one of the prominent scholars, it's been a while since I wrote this, so hopefully I'm remembering this correctly. I think it's Ibn Omar. So this would be the son of Omar, the second caliph, comes up to her and says, don't worry. This does not represent the fate of Ibn Zubayr. He says, he says the spirits are with God, like the spirits of human beings are with God. Yeah. So in many ways, the idea is, can you read if you—
That's exactly right. Page 45, everyone.
Oh yeah.
Got it.
Can you really hurt a person by doing something to their corpse? And the message seems to be like, no, a righteous person, their ruh, like their life force or their spirit is kind of beyond being injured.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passage. And then you write, if I just quote you here, just to finish the anecdote, to which Asma replied, nothing hinders me from bearing this, that is bearing the sadness and the grief. For even the head of John the Baptist was made into a gift for one of the Israelite harlots.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
Serious stuff.
I forgot about that. That's a good one.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a great read. Really, really fascinating. It's gory. So like, yeah.
Unfortunately, the nature, it has to be gory in order to do the kind of analysis, to understand like really its cultural importance. You have to get into some of that.
Yes.
That nitty-gritty, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, maybe this, I'll try to segue somehow to the next book. I mean, it's interesting that both of those characters have really, by which I mean Abdullah ibn Zubair and Zayd ibn Ali, have really conspicuous claims to proximity to the Prophet, right? Obviously, Zayd being a direct descendant, but Ibn Zubair being connected to a prominent companion. Yeah, and then Zayd obviously has an important afterlife for the Zaydiyya. He's not, if I'm getting this right, he's not an imam for the Ithna Ashariya, for the main 12 or Shiites, but he is obviously for the Zaydiyya. So I mean, it just shows how complicated and violent the beginnings of Islam can be. Speaking of which, let me say a couple of things about this book. I try not to go on too long, so we'll try to stop in about 10 minutes or so. We'll see. People are able to see now in their videos if we actually did it or not. Let's see if we hold true to that. This book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, The Making the Prophet of Islam, which explores early Islam, including the question of the Islamic sources and their authenticity, or the role that they can play in scholarship on the emergence of Islam, is really important. I thought I'd start with just a general question. There have been people out there, I think one of our colleagues wrote a blog on not using the phrase Islamic origins. I don't know if you do actually offhand, it's not in the title. I have a seminar entitled Islamic Origins, so that made me feel really awkward. Do you have any thoughts about that debate? Is it okay to speak about origins?
I'm an American pragmatist. To me, as long as you kind of set the terms of what it means to you and make it clear. I'm not the one to kind of send down interdictions on words and things like that. I don't like that type of critique. I think a lot of times it has a very naive understanding of how words work, how language works, and it's a process that never ends too, because of semantic drift. And this is so I have no problem. Say origins. I don't care. Just be able to conceptualize it, right? Like I want you to be able to have to not hide behind words,
right?
Be able to dig down deeper and justify it. If you can justify it, and it's compelling, then have at it.
Right. Okay. Now, one of the ways I thought of Muhammad and the Empires of Faith is as a response to, as a serious response to the claim, which maybe I've made in certain ways, that the Islamic sources are difficult, if not impossible, to use to get at what really happened. I mean, your sort of conversation partner there is Patricia Crone, who said you can accept them, something like you can accept them or reject them, but you can't work with them. Is that right? It was a quotation, something like that?
That's pretty cool. That's close enough, if that's right.
Okay, all right, something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, is that a good way of conceptualizing this project? Is that what you're up to here, to show that, yes, you can work with them?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, I think that the sources that are available to us have changed significantly. And I think there's a lot of shorthand that folks have been lazily relying upon, and maybe it's just a byproduct of some of the outdated materials that we teach with and stuff like that, which you always learn when you're going from, like, when you're kind of going to the newer scholarship to kind of the older ways of just conceptualizing and building a course or building a system and things like that. So I want to intervene on a number of levels. So I'll just might as well just tell you one of my the things that annoy the crap out of me the most. So when people say something like, our earliest biography of the Prophet Muhammad is by Ibn Hisham, is written by Ibn Ishaq, but we only know Ibn Ishaq through Ibn Hisham, and who knows all the things that he changed or left out. And it's so totally wrong. I think it's like, to me, like, the number of sources that we have that are that represent the early Arabic tradition, the early Arabic historiographical tradition that emerged in the 2nd century, which is shared by the Umayyads and the Abbasids equally, is very large and very robust. And I think it's totally underappreciated. And so part of me, I wanted to push back and say, we have some in a impressive number of sources. I mean, you can just like name them. It's not just like Ibn Ishaq, but like my other guy, Muhammad ibn Rashid. We're going to soon have Musa ibn Uqba, whose manuscript was just discovered and is going to be published. We have people like Ibn Jurayj in his tafsir. We have Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. We have Abdullah ibn Mubarak. We have Malik ibn Anas. And like, that's just some of them. We can kind of expand upon the stuff with even non-Sunni material. Like one of the materials that Patricia herself worked on that I think is still overly neglected is the Risala of Salih ibn Dhakwan, which is an Ibadi text, so it's a non-Sunni text, and it contains a lot of very interesting historical narrative in it. And this, to her, is more or less written sometime around the turn of the 7th and 8th century, so around 700 or so. And there we already have the general outline of early Islamic history. We have the idea of Uthman codifying the Quran to give a more Quranic example. Quotations directly from the Quran throughout the entirety of the text is more or less the same thing. I mean, these sources I think need to be given their day, but at the same time, I don't want to say that there's so much that we know 100% for certain. Kind of the main metaphor that I like to use is the idea of like of high resolution versus low resolution. I think that we have a pretty robust low resolution image of what the Prophet Muhammad's life was in its basic outline. I think we have a really great idea of what his preaching was about. I think that's recorded in the Quran. I think that's our saying source. That's our cue. And I think that the general outline of his life goes around this hinge of the Hijrah. I think you can deduce that from the Quran. I think you also have robust reason to believe that the general outline in the Sirah literature is correct as well. And I think we can do stuff with that. Now, if you go down to a more higher resolution question, things get really interesting and things get very difficult to affirm the historicity. Like, so I would never in a million years myself, like say that the story in Ibn Ishaq about the year of the elephant, for example, Abraha marching the elephant up to siege Mecca, and then Muhammad's born that year, and blah, blah, blah. I think that's totally a historical.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
With some hesitation, because this is really, really interesting. But let me give you another example. So that's from the year of Muhammad's birth, the tradition of the elephant. So dated through a complicated way through 570. But what about just something from his life, in his career particularly, and something you deal with towards the end of the book, which is the call narrative. So what would you say about that? I mean, you have an interesting sort of thought experiment by comparing it to, I think, some English monk guy who had a similar sort of experience. But like, could we ever know something that Muhammad was really on Mount Hira, and whether or not you believe in the angelic visitation, but had some experience there of feeling that he had a revelation?
Yeah. So my version of that is basically no. I don't think that that's a historical story, even though I think it might have historical elements in it. So what in my last one, what I try to show is that a lot of the Sira literature was written to compete with, and in the process of competing, drew from hagiographic models. And we can see these hagiographical models by comparing the stories. Like, so the story that you mentioned is Kedmon. So his story appears in the Ecclesiastical History of the Venerable Bede, and his story matches the Prophet Muhammad's Iqra story beat for beat, and it's extraordinary how close they are. And considering that they were, separated by thousands of kilometers, which, 1,000 kilometers back then was many, many more kilometers than they are now. So someone writing in the marshes of Northumbria versus someone like writing maybe in the Hejaz or in Syria or in Baghdad or whatever, these are very different localities. How can we explain their similarities, right? And so I'd argue that they're both drawing from a common kind of hagiographical store of material. And that's why they look similar. And I try to keep open the possibility that perhaps the Arabic story could have influenced the Latin story or whatever. I've become less influenced of that, less convinced of that option, I think, since I wrote the book. And maybe if I rewrote it, I would be a bit more strong on like the common hagiographical source for a number of reasons. But I don't think that is necessarily historical story. But also I do think it does have historical elements in it. And so what do I mean by that? So when, like in a lot of my grad classes, when we deal with these stories, we talk about the differences between semantic memory and episodic memory. Okay? So memory is a funny thing, right? I don't know if you ever had this experience where you had this memory of an event or whatever, you were sure that you were there, or you knew someone that was sure they were there and experienced it, but then you later have a record of it, you weren't really there or something like that. I'll give you like one of my examples from my life. When I've always had kind of long hair, at least most of my life. And when I was in college, I used to do this silly thing where I would act like I hit my head on something and make my hair go away. It was dumb. It's this juvenile joke that I'd like, oops, and then act silly in public. And I had this one time that it backfired on me because I act like I hit something and I turned around and I didn't see someone was sitting next to me and I fell over them and I was like spread eagle over the guy's lap and I'm absolutely humiliated. And so I used to tell that story to one of my friends and we'd laugh about it. And somehow one of my friends from college, even though he wasn't there, he got to this thing where he liked to tell the story, and he would always tell the story as if he was there. I didn't even know him at the time the event happened, but he told that story again and again, and we would laugh whenever he told the story. What he didn't know is we were laughing because we're laughing at him because he was like, and then I saw him with my own eyes. Like he had a false memory that he kept on retelling, right? And so that being said, memory can fool you in terms of episodes that you remember from your life. You can create fake episodes, you can have fake memories and not even realize it and things like that. However, there's a semantic aspect of memory that seems to be pretty reliable. So these are things like, well, he doesn't have a memory of me being on Mars and this happening, or even in London or whatever. His memory of me of this stuff happening all took place in the location where I was from. Right. And so the semantic aspects, like there was a place called Mount Hira, there was a place called Mecca, and things like that. I think those things are broadly accurate. I think just like
that's clear.
Yeah. Like those things to me are a lot harder to kind of make up out of nowhere.
So, and we're getting over time here, so I haven't held good to the 10 minutes that I promised, but yeah, I mean, what do you think about, something that, I don't know, appears here and there in mostly Western scholarship, which is the how do you put it, like the productive nature of storytelling for history.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about another anecdote that you analyze in this book, which is the story of an emissary delivering the prophet's letter to Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, I think in Damascus. I think it's not in Constantinople, but in Damascus.
In Busra. It's in Busra.
It's in Busra. Okay, so in Syria, but not in. Okay, so in Busra.
I think maybe it depends on the version too. So
okay. In any case, it's definitely Syria because Abu Sufyan, the prophet's nemesis, but later Muslim, shows up. I mean, so storytelling. I'll just give you my 2 cents on this really quickly, and you can, push back or whatever. But I mean, we know that storytelling produces narratives in part because. Not only with early Islam, but also with Christianity and Judaism and everything else. American history, we have all these stories, which sometimes are just outlandish. So a sort of a good rational critique would probably undermine them, or which contradict each other, or which are so obviously playing a certain function, like they just fit so neatly into that function that, I don't know. Like an anecdote which explains an ambiguity in a text. So, like for example, one that I like to raise with my students is twice the Quran says that the Israelites in Medina, or the Jews, they would say to the Prophet, "Our hearts are covered." Well, it's a little more confusing than that, but. And so then we get stories which say, oh, Muhammad was walking in Medina, he was preaching Islam to them, and they said, we won't listen to you because our hearts are covered. So that kind of story, like, did it really take place? Well, it fits so well the function of giving a story to explain the text that it makes me skeptical. So in this, all the way back to Heraclius, Abu Sufyan, and the emissary and the prophet's letter, all of that, I mean, isn't that like that kind of story just storytelling? Does it have to have any connection to history at all?
That's a story that I think is totally like ahistorical, even though it's really, really early. It doesn't have to have any kind of connection to history. I think a lot of times what we get with these stories is, what we get with these stories when we do kind of our source critical analysis of them, we try to find all the different versions and things like that. We definitely get a sense of how the sausage is made, right? So we have a sense of like, well, how was the story that we know of made? Why does it exist? For what purpose?
Just to say,
original context. What's it draw from? So is the original context? This is one thing I sometimes get. Is the original context al-Bukhari compiling his Sahih, because this story appears in the Sahih al-Bukhari, right? Does it reflect an ideology of Bukhari, or is he drawing upon an earlier source? And what is that earlier source? And what about, and so if you trace kind of the history of these stories, we sort of learn about the ideologies that are behind them, right? And so for me, what you learn from tracing the origins of that story in particular is the way that early Muslims saw themselves as party to sort of a contest of empires, or really, to use their words, contest of dominions, right? Who has God given dominion, right? And who is God kind of favoring?
Is the Arabic word mulk behind that?
Yeah, mulk. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, like, really what this is a story about this kind of ideology of why has God favored us and disfavored them, right? And it's interesting in all sorts of other aspects too, insofar as it has a portrayal of Heraclius, right? And so how is he portrayed, and what's its literary function of his depiction is this and that and the other, and things like that, and how do those depictions draw from what they the historical realities of the person who's telling the story. I mean, so there's a lot of parallel stories about these rulers. Like one of the other examples, I think the Heraclius story is a model for the other stories, but the other story about a prominent ruler is the Shah, the ruler of Persia, how he receives his letter and from the prophet, and he rips it to shreds, right? And of course, the response to that is that your kingdom will be ripped to shreds, right? But Hercules and his kingdom kind of survives. And why is that, you know? And for that first story, you have this kind of appeal, I think, this parable of Jesus, right? Where, you know, God kind of gives the land to kind of new tenants, right? Because of the sins of the previous tenants. And you have this interesting theology of supersession that comes into play.
That's great. Yeah, really interesting. It just, the tenants bit is, I think, your translation for this difficult word, arasiyin or something, which previously, I don't know if Irfan Shahid translated as heresies, he might have, but other people have, if it wasn't him. So
the first, so it is still common. The first person to notice, that's such an this is kind of what started me on this one thing, was the first person to notice this word aris in Arabic. Well, it's an Arabic borrowing, but where it came from, because it is lexicographically, it's weird in Arabic. It's not really an Arabic word. The first person to notice this was Larry Conrad.
Okay.
And he's the one that connected it to a specific Christian Palestinian Aramaic dialect. And that's kind of what helped me connect the origin of the story to that, the milieu of early Islamic Palestine. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to show everyone, to show off for you in a second, that Professor Anthony has done the really hard work of showing all the chains of transmission of this anecdote. That's specifically the chains of transmission on the Heraclius story. So I think we have to move to an end. But yeah, I'd really encourage everyone to buy this book. And you probably got a sense of it from our conversation, but I think Professor Anthony there takes really seriously the task of a historian, and avoiding extremes of revisionism, or a naive approach to the sources. So it's just a model of scholarship. Real quickly, if people want to stay in touch with your work, or and with other things you're up to, how should they do that, or any
Yeah, they should. I mean, I'm on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter.
You have a great handle there.
Yeah, Sean. Yeah. So and then also I have my academia page. Usually I post most of my stuff up there on academia.edu for open access stuff. Yeah. So yeah, you can follow me that way. Yeah. Great. I try to keep things coming out on a regular basis.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sean.
Great. Thanks, Gabe.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.